Germany, winter of 1945. The war had ended, but hunger was still the enemy. Bombed cities lay in ashes, and the cold wind cut through broken windows like knives. Mothers wrapped their starving children in scraps of old curtains, praying for a miracle that never came. Then, one gray morning, the rumble of American trucks echoed through the ruined streets. Villagers froze half in fear, half in disbelief. From the trucks stepped soldiers in unfamiliar green uniforms. The mothers clutched their children tighter, expecting punishment, revenge, humiliation. But what came instead were loaves of bread, warm, steaming, smelling of life. Blankets, soft and dry, were handed to trembling hands. One soldier knelt before a crying boy, broke the bread in half, and smiled. The boy's mother fell to her knees and wept, not out of shame or defeat, but because kindness, after so much cruelty, hurt more than hunger. No one spoke. Only the sound of children eating broke the silence. That day, the line between enemy and savior blurred, and somewhere in that ruined village, a German mother realized that compassion, even from the hands of a former enemy, could rebuild the soul faster than any treaty could rebuild a city. The village of Heidelfeld had once been beautiful. Before the bombs, before the fires, before the silence that replaced the church bells, it had been a place where children played in cobblestone streets, and women hung laundry between half-timbered houses that leaned toward each other like old friends, sharing secrets. But by December of 1945, Heidelfeld was a graveyard of what used to be. Anna Mueller stood at the threshold of what remained of her home. 3 walls still stood. The 4th had collapsed into rubble the night the Allied bombers passed overhead, mistaking their small village for a military target 20 kilometers south. Her husband, Friedrich, had died 2 years earlier on the Eastern Front. His last letter arrived 6 months after his death, stained with mud and folded so many times the creases had worn through the paper. She read it once. Then she burned it for warmth. Now Anna had 2 children to keep alive. Wilhelm, age 8, and Greta, barely 5. Wilhelm had his father's serious eyes and had learned not to complain when his stomach cramped with hunger. Greta still cried sometimes, thin whimpering sounds that broke Anna's heart more than any artillery shell ever could. The village had 93 survivors. Most were women, children, and old men too frail to have been conscripted. They moved through the ruins like ghosts, foraging for frozen potatoes in abandoned fields, burning furniture for heat, boiling leather scraps into something that might trick the body into thinking it had eaten. Anna had stopped counting the days. Time was measured differently now, not in hours or weeks, but in moments of survival. One more morning, one more night, one more breath of frigid air that burned the lungs and reminded you that you were still alive, even if you no longer knew why. The Americans were coming. Everyone knew it. Rumors spread faster than typhus through the shattered villages. Some said the soldiers would execute anyone who had supported the regime. Others whispered that they would take the women, burn what little remained, leave nothing but ash and memory. Anna did not know what to believe. She only knew that her children were starving, and that winter did not care about politics or borders, or which flag flew over the ruins. On the morning of December 18th, Wilhelm woke with a fever. His forehead burned beneath Anna's cracked palm, and his breathing came shallow and quick. Greta sat beside him, holding his hand with the solemn concentration of a child who had learned too early that love sometimes meant silence. Anna had nothing left to trade. The wedding ring, the last piece of gold she owned, had been exchanged 3 weeks earlier for half a loaf of bread, so moldy she had to scrape the green away before feeding it to the children. Her mother's silver locket went for a handful of dried beans. The china her grandmother brought from Bavaria was bartered for a single blanket, threadbare and stained, but warmer than newspaper. She wrapped Wilhelm in that blanket now and whispered promises she could not keep, that he would feel better soon, that spring would come, that someone, somewhere, still remembered they were human. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that refused to fall. The cold was absolute, the kind that settled into bones and refused to leave. Anna pulled her shawl tighter. It had been a tablecloth once, before the war taught her that survival had no room for sentimentality and stepped into the street. Other women moved through the ruins with the same desperate determination. Frau Schultz, whose son had been hanged for desertion in the final weeks of the war. Frau Weber, who had lost her mind after watching her home collapse with her mother still inside. Frau Klein, whose hands shook constantly now, as if her body could not forget the bombs even though her mind tried to. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. They had all lost everything. They had all become experts in grief. Anna made her way toward the old church, or what remained of it. The steeple had toppled during an air raid in March, crushing the cemetery beneath tons of stone and timber. But the cellar still stood. And sometimes, if you were lucky, if you were desperate enough, you could find things in the rubble. A forgotten jar of preserves. A sack of flour, overlooked in the chaos. Anything that might buy one more day. She dug through frozen debris until her fingers bled, but found nothing. When she returned home, Wilhelm's fever had worsened. His lips had turned pale, and his eyes had that distant look she had seen before, the look of someone preparing to leave. Greta sat beside him, singing a lullaby their grandmother used to sing, her small voice thin and wavering in the cold. Anna knelt beside her children and prayed to a God she no longer believed in. She prayed because there was nothing else left to do. She prayed because the alternative was to give up, and she had two reasons not to give up. And they were both right here, breathing, still alive. That night, she burned the last chair for warmth. The flames lasted 2 hours. Then the cold returned, merciless and absolute. The rumors grew louder over the following days. The Americans were 10 kilometers away, 5 kilometers, just beyond the ridge. Some villagers spoke of fleeing into the forest, but there was nowhere left to run, and no strength left to run with. On the morning of December 21st, Frau Weber burst into Anna's shelter, her eyes wide with fear. "They are here," she whispered. "The Americans. They are coming down the main road." Anna's heart seized. She pulled Wilhelm and Greta close, feeling their fragile bodies against hers, bones and skin and stubborn heartbeats that refused to quit. "Stay here," she told them. "Do not go outside, no matter what you hear." But curiosity and hunger are stronger than fear in children who have already seen the worst. Wilhelm insisted on looking through the gap in the wall, and Anna did not have the strength to stop him. Through the broken stones, they watched as a convoy of trucks rolled into the village square. The engines rumbled like distant thunder, and the sound alone was enough to send several villagers scrambling for cover. Anna held her breath, waiting for the gunfire, the shouting, the violence that history had taught them to expect. But the trucks simply stopped, the engines cut off, and in the sudden silence, doors opened. Men climbed out, soldiers in green uniforms, their breath visible in the frozen air. They carried rifles, yes, but they also carried something else. Crates, heavy wooden crates that required 2 men to lift. Anna's mind struggled to make sense of it. Were those weapons? Supplies? What kind of conqueror arrives with crates instead of chains? One soldier stood taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone and eyes that seemed too tired for someone so young. He surveyed the ruins with an expression Anna could not read, not anger, not pity, but something in between, something human. His name was James O'Donnell, though Anna would not learn that until later. He was 26 years old. He had been a factory worker in Boston before the war, boxing on weekends for extra money, dreaming of opening a gym someday where neighborhood kids could learn to protect themselves. The war had other plans. James had landed on Omaha Beach. He had fought through hedgerows in Normandy, survived the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, and watched too many good men die in mud and snow and fire. He had seen enough death to last a dozen lifetimes. But what haunted him most was not the violence, it was the faces of the children in every village they liberated. The hollow eyes, the distended bellies, the way they looked at soldiers with a mixture of hope and terror, as if they could no longer tell the difference. His sister, Mary, had died of hunger during the Great Depression. She was 9 years old. The banks had failed, his father lost his job, And there was no food, no help, no mercy from a world that had forgotten how to care. James remembered holding her hand as she slipped away, remembered the way her breathing slowed and stopped, remembered the weight of her body as he carried her to the church, because his mother could not bear to do it. He had joined the army to fight fascism, but somewhere along the way, he realized he was also fighting for every child who had ever gone to bed hungry, for every mother who had ever felt powerless, for every family that had been chewed up and spat out by forces beyond their control. And now, standing in this ruined German village, looking at the hollow-eyed women and skeletal children peeking out from behind rubble, he saw Mary everywhere. "Spread out," he ordered his men. "We distribute everything. No one gets left behind." Private Tommy Carter, a farm boy from Nebraska, blinked in confusion. "Sarge, these are Germans, enemy civilians." James turned to him, and his voice was quiet but firm. "The war is over, Carter. These are just people now. Hungry people. And we have food." He hoisted a crate onto his shoulder and walked toward the village square. His men hesitated, then followed. They had learned to trust Sergeant O'Donnell. He had kept them alive through hell. If he said these people deserved help, then they deserved help. Anna watched from her shelter as the soldiers began opening the crates. Her breath caught. Inside were loaves of bread, dozens of them. Fresh bread, still soft, wrapped in cloth. There were also blankets thick, military-issue wool blankets and tins of food and bars of chocolate and things Anna had not seen in so long she had almost forgotten they existed. The villagers emerged slowly, like animals who had learned to fear every sound. They moved with caution, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. An old man stepped forward first, his back bent with age and hardship. A soldier handed him a loaf of bread. The old man stared at it, as if it might vanish, then clutched it to his chest and wept. One by one the others came. Women with children clinging to their skirts. Teenagers who looked 50. A priest with a bandaged head. They lined up, silent and trembling, as the American soldiers handed out food and blankets with the efficiency of men who had done this before. James moved through the crowd, his eyes scanning faces, looking for anyone who might need extra help. That was when he saw the boy. Wilhelm had slipped out of the shelter despite his mother's warnings. Fever still burned in his cheeks, but hunger was stronger than sickness. He stood at the edge of the square, too weak to push through the crowd, too proud to beg. James saw him, and something inside his chest cracked open. The boy looked exactly like the kids back in his Boston neighborhood, the same defiant chin, the same refusal to cry even when the world gave you every reason to. He walked over, knelt down so they were eye to eye, and held out a loaf of bread. Wilhelm stared at it, then at the soldier, then back at the bread. His hands trembled as he reached out, half expecting it to be snatched away at the last second. But James simply placed the bread in his hands and smiled. Not a pitying smile, not a condescending one. Just the smile of one human being acknowledging another. Wilhelm's fingers closed around the bread, and for a moment he could not move, could not speak, could only stand there, holding this impossible gift, trying to understand what it meant. Then Anna appeared. She had run after her son the moment she realized he was gone, panic driving her feet through the rubble. She stopped short when she saw Wilhelm standing before the American soldier, bread in his hands, tears streaming down his face. She rushed forward, pulling Wilhelm behind her, shielding him with her body even though there was nothing to shield him from. She looked up at James with eyes full of fear and confusion and something else, something that might have been gratitude but was too overwhelmed to know its own name. James stood slowly, his hands open and non-threatening. He reached into his pack and pulled out a blanket. He held it out to Anna. She stared at him, stared at the blanket, stared at this stranger in a uniform who should have been her enemy, but was instead offering warmth to her dying son. She took the blanket, and then, without warning, her knees gave out. She fell to the frozen ground, the blanket clutched in her hands, and she wept. Great, shuddering sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside her, she did not know that place still existed. She wept for her husband, who would never come home, for her children who had learned hunger before they learned to read, for every mother in every war who had ever held a child and known there was nothing left to give. She wept because kindness, after so much cruelty, was more than the heart could bear. James knelt beside her, not touching, just present. He did not speak. He did not try to comfort her with empty words. He simply stayed there, in the cold, in the ruins, bearing witness to her grief, because that was all anyone could do. Around them, other mothers began to cry. One by one, they fell to their knees in the snow, clutching bread and blankets, finally allowing themselves to feel the weight of everything they had survived. The sound filled the square, not screams of anguish, but something softer, something that sounded almost like relief. The war had taught them to be hard, to be silent, to swallow every emotion, because emotion was a luxury they could not afford. But this soldier, this stranger, this former enemy, he had given them permission to be human again. Wilhelm pressed against his mother's side, the bread still warm in his hands. He looked up at James and said, in careful, broken English, "Thank you." James nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. He had seen men die with courage. He had seen soldiers sacrifice themselves for their brothers, but he had never seen anything braver than a starving child who still remembered how to say thank you. He stood and continued distributing supplies, moving through the crowd with quiet efficiency. But every few moments, his eyes drifted back to Anna and her children, huddled together in the snow, eating bread as if it were the most sacred thing in the world. Private Carter approached him, his own eyes red. "Sarge," he said quietly, "I think we brought enough for seconds." "Should we?" "Give them everything," James said. "We can resupply. They cannot." Carter nodded and passed the word. The soldiers emptied every crate, distributed every blanket, handed out every tin of food, until there was nothing left. They gave away their own rations, their personal supplies, anything that might help these people survive one more day. As the sun began to set, James found himself standing alone at the edge of the square. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket, a habit he had developed during the war, writing down thoughts he did not want to forget. He wrote about the boy with the fever, about the mother who fell to her knees, about the way grief and gratitude looked exactly the same when etched onto a human face. He wrote, "Mary, I saw you today in 100 faces. I could not save you, but maybe I can save them. Maybe that counts for something. Maybe that is how we make meaning out of all this madness." He closed the notebook and looked up at the darkening sky. Snow had finally begun to fall, soft and silent, covering the ruins like a blanket. For a moment, the village looked almost peaceful, almost beautiful. Anna approached him slowly, Wilhelm leaning against her side, wrapped in the American blanket. Greta clung to her mother's hand, a piece of chocolate smeared across her face, the first sweet thing she had tasted in over a year. "You saved my son," Anna said in halting English. She had learned a little from a British prisoner of war who worked in her uncle's shop before the war, before the world went insane. James shook his head. "I just gave him bread." "No," Anna said firmly. "You gave him hope. That is harder to find than bread." They stood together in the falling snow, two people who should have been enemies, bound together by the simple truth that suffering has no nationality and kindness needs no translation. "What is your name?" Anna asked. "James. James O'Donnell." "I am Anna. Anna Muller." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you, James O'Donnell, for remembering we are human." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He reached into his pack one more time and pulled out a small tin of soup. "For the boy," he said. "It will help with the fever." Anna took it with trembling hands. She wanted to say more, to find words big enough to hold everything she felt. But there were no such words, so she simply bowed her head and turned away, guiding her children back toward their shelter. James watched them go, 3 shadows moving through the snow, a little stronger than they had been that morning. Around him, The other soldiers were packing up, preparing to move to the next village, the next town, the next group of people who needed help. Private Carter stood beside him, staring at the empty crates. "My dad fought in the First War," he said quietly. "He used to say we were fighting to end all wars. Guess that did not work out." "No," James agreed. "But maybe we fight anyway. Not to win. Just to make sure someone survives to build something better." Carter nodded slowly. "You think these people will remember this? What we did here?" James looked at the village, at the faces watching from doorways and broken windows, at the children clutching bread like treasure. "I do not know," he said honestly. "But I will remember them. And maybe that is enough." They stood in silence as night fell over Heidelfeld, watching the snow cover the ruins, making everything clean and new, if only for a moment. In her shelter, Anna fed Wilhelm the soup. He ate slowly, his fever beginning to break, his eyes growing clearer. Greta had already fallen asleep, the chocolate still clutched in her small fist. Anna wrapped both children in the American blanket and held them close, feeling their heartbeats, steady and strong. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to hope. Not that the world would magically heal, not that the war would be undone, but that people, even strangers, even enemies, were capable of seeing each other's humanity. And that maybe, just maybe, that was how the world began to heal, one loaf of bread at a time. Outside, the snow continued to fall. And in the distance, the sound of American trucks faded into the night, carrying their cargo of compassion to the next ruined village, the next desperate mothers, the next generation of children who deserved a better world than the one they had been born into. The war had ended, but the real battle, the battle to rebuild not just cities but souls, was only beginning. And on that frozen December night in a village called Heidelfeld, one sergeant and one mother proved that even in the aftermath of unimaginable destruction, human kindness could still break through the darkness. Wilhelm opened his eyes and looked up at his mother. "Mama," he whispered, "will the soldier come back?" Anna stroked his hair, her fingers gentle. "I do not know. I want to thank him again. When I am bigger, when I have something to give him." Anna smiled through her tears. "Then we will remember him," she said. "We will remember his name and what he did. And someday, when you are strong again, you will pass that kindness forward." Wilhelm nodded solemnly, as if taking a sacred vow. Then he closed his eyes and slept, his breathing deep and even, his fever finally broken. Anna sat awake long into the night, watching her children sleep, wrapped in the blanket that still smelled faintly of soap in distant places. She thought about the soldier with the tired eyes and the gentle hands. She thought about the war and everything it had stolen. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days that might now be possible. Because one man decided that compassion was stronger than hate. The snow fell, the night passed, and in the ruins of Heidelfeld, life fragile and precious and impossibly stubborn continued. Over the following days, Sergeant O'Donnell and his unit remained in the area, establishing a temporary relief station in what had once been the village school. The roof was mostly intact, and the soldiers worked to clear debris, set up field kitchens, and organize medical care for the most vulnerable. James found himself drawn back to Anna's shelter. He told himself it was duty checking on the sick boy, ensuring the family had enough supplies. But the truth was more complicated. In Anna's quiet strength, in the way she held her children and refused to let despair win, he saw an echo of his own mother. The mother who had survived the depression, who had buried one child and raised another, who had taught him that love was not a feeling but an action. He brought medicine for Wilhelm, powdered milk for Greta, extra blankets against the deepening cold. Each time, Anna accepted with gratitude but never with the servility of the defeated. She held her head high. She met his eyes as equals. She made it clear that she accepted his help not because she was conquered, but because her children needed to survive. "You do not have to keep coming," she said one afternoon, as James helped her reinforce the remaining walls with salvaged timber. You have done more than enough. I know, James said, hammering a nail into place. But I want to help. Anna studied him for a long moment. Why? James paused, the hammer heavy in his hand. Because I have seen what happens when we stop seeing each other as human. I have seen what we become when we let hate win. And I am tired of it. I am tired of death and destruction and senseless cruelty. I want to build something instead of destroying it. Anna nodded slowly. The war did not make monsters of us, she said quietly. We made monsters of each other. And now, we must learn to be human again. It was the most profound thing anyone had said to him in years. James looked at this widow in her ruined village, this mother who had lost everything but refused to lose herself, and he understood that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it carried a rifle, sometimes it just got up each morning and chose to keep living. Wilhelm recovered slowly. The fever broke. The medicine worked. And within a week he was strong enough to help his mother with small tasks. He followed James around the relief station, asking questions in his careful English, learning about America and Boston and what the world looked like beyond the ruins of Germany. Is there food in America? He asked one day, his eyes wide. More than we know what to do with, James admitted. We throw away more food than some countries ever see. Wilhelm frowned, processing this information. That seems wrong. It is wrong, James agreed. But maybe your generation will figure out how to do better. The boy nodded seriously, as if accepting a mission. I will remember, he said. When I am grown, I will remember that food is not for wasting. It is for sharing. James ruffled his hair, throat tight with emotion. You are going to be just fine, kid. Better than fine. But even as the relief efforts continued, the reality of military orders loomed. The unit could not stay indefinitely. There were other towns, other refugees, other desperate situations requiring attention. Resources were limited, and the chain of command had no patience for soldiers who grew too attached to any one place. On January 7th, new orders arrived. Sergeant O'Donnell's unit was to move north to assist with refugee resettlement efforts near the border. They had 48 hours to prepare. James received the news in silence, then walked alone to the edge of the village where the forest began. The trees stood bare and skeletal against the winter sky, and the wind cut through his uniform like it was made of paper. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and stared at nothing. He had known this was coming. He had prepared himself for it. But knowing and accepting were different things. That evening, he told Anna. They were sitting in her shelter, the children asleep in the corner, wrapped in layers of blankets and coats. A small fire burned in a makeshift stove James had constructed from an old oil drum. We leave in 2 days, he said quietly. Anna's hands stilled on the sock she was mending. I see. The village council has been notified. They will coordinate with the International Red Cross. More supplies are coming. You will not be abandoned. I know. They sat in silence, watching the firelight dance on the broken walls. Everything that needed to be said felt too big for words, so they said nothing at all. Finally, Anna spoke. You saved our lives. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, you gave us the chance to survive. That is not a small thing. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Will you go back to Boston? She asked. Eventually, after I am discharged. I have a mother there, a neighborhood, a life I left behind. Will you tell them about us? Every day, James said. I will tell them about the widow who refused to give up, about the boy who said thank you even when he was starving, about the village that taught me more about humanity than any church or politician ever could. Anna smiled, tears bright in her eyes. Then we will not be forgotten. Never. James promised. On the morning of January 9th, the unit prepared to depart. Villagers gathered in the square, silent and solemn, watching as soldiers loaded equipment onto trucks. Children who had learned to laugh again stood with their mothers, clutching small gifts they had made: carved wooden figures, woven bracelets, drawings on scraps of paper. Wilhelm approached James, holding something wrapped in cloth. He had been working on it for days, using tools borrowed from the priest and wood salvaged from the church ruins. For you, Wilhelm said. his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. James unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden cross, rough but beautifully made, with James's initials carved into the center. "So you remember us," Wilhelm said. James knelt down, eye level with the boy, and gripped his shoulder firmly. "I could never forget you. Not in 1,000 years." He pulled the boy into a brief, fierce hug, then stood and tucked the cross carefully into his jacket pocket, right over his heart. Anna approached last. She had been hanging back, trying to keep her composure. But now she stepped forward with the dignity of someone saying goodbye to a friend. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." James wanted to say so much, that she was the bravest person he had ever met, that her children would grow up to be remarkable because of her strength, that she had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. But all he said was, "Take care of them. Always." They shook hands, a formal gesture between equals, and then Anna did something unexpected. She reached up and kissed him on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude and respect and farewell. "Go home, James O'Donnell," she whispered. "Go home and build a good life. You have earned it." The convoy pulled out as the sun rose over Heidelfeld. James sat in the back of a truck, watching the village grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the hills. He touched the wooden cross in his pocket and closed his eyes. Private Carter sat beside him, uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he said, "Do you think we made a difference?" James opened his eyes and looked at the brightening sky. "Yes," he said, "I think we did." The years passed. James returned to Boston in the summer of 1946, honorably discharged, decorated for bravery, haunted by memories he would carry forever. He opened the gym he had always dreamed of, teaching neighborhood kids how to box and how to stand up for themselves and how to treat others with respect. He never married, never had children of his own, but he became a father figure to dozens of boys who needed guidance, discipline, and someone who believed in them when no one else did. He kept the wooden cross on his desk, and whenever someone asked about it, he told the story of a widow named Anna and her son Wilhelm, and a village that taught him what it meant to be human. In Germany, Anna rebuilt her life piece by piece. The village slowly recovered, aided by the Marshall Plan and the stubborn refusal of its people to let history defeat them. She never remarried, channeling all her love and energy into raising her children. Wilhelm grew up strong and serious, driven by the promise he had made to himself that winter night. He became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating young people about the cost of war and the value of compassion. He taught them that enemies were made, not born, and that peace required more courage than violence ever would. He never forgot the American soldier who gave him bread. In 1973, Wilhelm, now a man of 36, married with children of his own, traveled to America for an educators' conference. He had saved for years to make the trip, but this was about more than professional development. He carried with him an old wooden cross, worn smooth by time and touch, and a promise made when he was 8 years old. He found James O'Donnell's name in a Boston phone book, but when he called the gym listed at that address, a young man answered and told him that James had passed away 2 years earlier. Heart attack. Died peacefully in his sleep. Wilhelm stood in that phone booth, holding the receiver, feeling the weight of missed opportunities and words left unspoken. But then the young man on the phone said, "Are you calling about the cross?" "Yes," Wilhelm managed. "How did you?" "He talked about you. The German kid who gave him a cross. Said if you ever came looking, we should take you to visit him. He is buried at St. Michael's Cemetery." Plot 47. The next morning, Wilhelm stood before James O'Donnell's grave. The headstone was simple: name, dates, and a single word: Sergeant. Wilhelm knelt in the grass and placed the wooden cross against the stone. Then, from his bag, he pulled out a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the bakery, and set it beside the cross. "I came to say thank you," he said quietly, not caring if anyone heard. "You saved my life. You taught me that kindness is not weakness, that enemies can become friends. That one person, Choosing to do the right thing can change everything. He sat there for a long time, talking to a man who could no longer hear him, saying all the things he had carried across an ocean in 3 decades. He talked about his mother, who lived to see her grandchildren, and who spoke of James until her final breath. He talked about Greta, now a nurse, dedicated to healing. He talked about the village, rebuilt and thriving, its children growing up in peace, and he made another promise, that he would pass the story forward, that his children and his students would know about Sergeant James O'Donnell from Boston, who proved that compassion could survive even the darkest chapters of human history. As Wilhelm stood to leave, an elderly woman approached, leaning on a cane. "You knew James?" she asked. "He saved my life," Wilhelm said, "when I was a child." In Germany, the woman smiled, tears in her eyes. "He talked about you, all the time. Said you were the reason he survived the war with his soul intact. Said, remembering, you made him believe the world could be better." Wilhelm could not speak, could only nod as tears streamed down his face. The woman patted his arm. "He would be glad you came, glad you remembered. I could never forget." She nodded and walked away, leaving Wilhelm alone with the grave and the memories and the proof that some connections transcend time and death and the vast distances between human hearts. That night, in his hotel room, Wilhelm wrote a letter to his mother. He told her about finding James's grave, about the bread and the cross, about the way even death could not diminish the power of what they had shared. He wrote, "You were right, Mama. Kindness does survive longer than victory. And the man who gave us bread when we had nothing, gave us something more valuable than food. He gave us the belief that people, at their core, are capable of tremendous good. I will carry that belief until I die. And I will make sure my children carry it after me." Anna received the letter 3 weeks later. She read it sitting in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that no longer had broken panes. She touched the paper gently, remembering the soldier with the tired eyes and the gentle hands, remembering the winter that almost killed them, remembering the day she learned that hope could arrive in the back of a truck, carried by strangers who chose to see her as human. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with other treasures. Friedrich's last letter home, Wilhelm's first school certificate, a faded photograph of Greta smiling. And there, among the pieces of a life rebuilt from ruins, she added her own memory to the collection. That evening, as the sun set over Heidelfeld, Anna walked to the rebuilt church and lit a candle, not for the dead, but for the living. For James O'Donnell, wherever his soul had gone, for her children and grandchildren, for every person who had ever chosen compassion over cruelty, mercy over revenge, love over hate. The candle burned bright in the dimness, a small flame against the darkness, but even the smallest flame, Anna had learned, could hold back the night. Years turned into decades. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. Heidelfeld became prosperous, its scars buried beneath new construction and manicured parks. The generation that remembered the war grew old and passed away, taking their memories with them into silence. But some stories refused to die. Wilhelm never stopped teaching. Even after retirement, he volunteered at schools, speaking to young people about the war, about its horrors, and about the American sergeant who proved that humanity could survive even in hell. He showed them the photograph he had managed to obtain from the Boston Globe archives, James O'Donnell in his uniform, young and serious, looking directly at the camera with those tired, compassionate eyes. "This man saved my life," Wilhelm would say, holding up the photograph. "Not because I deserved it, not because we were friends or allies, but because he chose to see me as a human being first and an enemy second. That choice, that simple, profound choice, is what saved not just my life, but my faith in humanity." One spring afternoon in 2018, Wilhelm stood before a classroom of 16-year-olds in Berlin. They slouched in their seats, scrolling through devices, only half listening. The war was ancient history to them, irrelevant. Something from textbooks and old movies. But Wilhelm had learned patience over the decades. He waited until they grew curious about his silence. Then he began to speak. He told them about the winter of 1945, about starvation so severe that children forgot how to play, about his mother burning furniture to keep them alive, about the morning the American trucks arrived and how he expected death but received bread instead. "I was 8 years old," he said quietly, "the same age as some of your younger siblings, and I thought I was going to die. Not dramatically, not quickly, just slowly, from hunger and cold, in my mother's arms." That was the world I knew. The room had grown silent. The devices were lowered, and then a soldier, a man who had every reason to hate me, to see me as the enemy, knelt down and gave me bread. He smiled at me, not with pity, not with condescension, but with kindness, real, genuine kindness. And in that moment, he taught me something I have never forgotten. "What?" a girl in the front row asked softly. "That we are not defined by the worst things our nations do. That we can choose, every single day, to be better than the hatred we inherit. That one act of compassion can ripple forward through time in ways we cannot even imagine." He paused, letting the words settle. That soldier, James O'Donnell, died before I could thank him properly. But I have spent my entire life trying to honor what he gave me. Not just the bread, the belief that people are worth saving, that we are all worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of which side of history we find ourselves on. A boy in the back raised his hand. "But Herr Mueller, they were the victors. We were the defeated. It is easy to be kind when you have won." Wilhelm smiled sadly. "You think it was easy?" James O'Donnell watched his comrades die. He fought through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He had every psychological justification to hate us, to want revenge. But he chose differently, not because it was easy, but because it was right. There is nothing easy about choosing compassion when the world has taught you to choose violence. The boy nodded slowly, thinking. Another student asked, "Did you ever find out why he did it? Why he helped you?" Wilhelm reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of a page from James's journal, sent to him by one of James's former students years after his death. The original entry, written in a cramped hand on yellowed paper, had been donated to a veterans museum in Boston. He read aloud, "These children did not start the war. They did not build the camps or drop the bombs. They are just children, scared and hungry, caught in the machinery of history. If I can give them bread today, maybe they grow up to be the generation that refuses to repeat our mistakes. Maybe that is how peace actually works, not through treaties and borders, but through small acts of mercy that plant seeds of hope." Wilhelm folded the paper carefully. He understood something that too many people forget, that children are not responsible for the sins of their parents, that punishment and revenge do not build a better world, that only compassion, extended even to our enemies, can break the cycle of hatred. The classroom remained silent long after the bell rang. Several students stayed behind, asking questions, wanting to know more. One girl, tears in her eyes, said, "I wish everyone could hear this story." "Then tell it," Wilhelm said simply. "That is how stories survive. That is how we honor the people who saved us. We remember, we share, we pass it forward." That evening, the girl went home and told her family about the American sergeant and the German boy. Her father, moved by the story, shared it with colleagues. A journalist heard about it and wrote an article. The article was picked up by international news agencies. Within weeks, the story of James O'Donnell and Anna Mueller had spread across the globe. People from dozens of countries reached out to Wilhelm. Veterans who had served with James. Historians researching post-war relief efforts. Teachers who wanted to use the story in their classrooms. And dozens of ordinary people who simply wanted to say that the story had touched them, reminded them of what was possible when we chose kindness over cruelty. An American filmmaker contacted Wilhelm, asking permission to document the story. Wilhelm agreed, on one condition: that the film focus not on him, but on the principle, that it make clear this was not about one miraculous soldier, but about what every person could choose to do in moments when the world demanded hatred. The documentary premiered in 2019 at film festivals in Berlin, Boston, and Jerusalem. It won no major awards, but it did something more important. It sparked conversations. In classrooms and living rooms and community centers around the world, people watched the story of James and Anna and Wilhelm. And they asked themselves what they would have done, what they would choose to do. Wilhelm watched the premiere in Berlin, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His daughter held his hand as the film showed archival footage of ruined German villages, then photographs of James in his uniform, then interviews with Wilhelm as an old man, telling his story one more time. When the lights came up, there was silence. Then applause, not polite, not obligatory, but the kind of applause that comes from deep recognition. The audience had seen themselves in the story, had understood that they too faced choices every day between compassion and indifference, between seeing others as human or seeing them as other. After the screening, a young American soldier in dress uniform approached Wilhelm. He stood at attention and saluted. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am currently deployed in the Middle East, and every day, I see people who are supposed to be my enemy. But after watching this, after hearing about Sergeant O'Donnell, I understand my mission differently now. It is not just about security or strategy. It is about remembering that everyone deserves dignity." Wilhelm returned the salute, tears in his old eyes. Then James's legacy lives on, not in monuments or medals, but in people like you, who choose to see the humanity in others. That is the real victory. That is what lasts. The soldier nodded, unable to speak. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small loaf of bread, the kind served at military mess halls, and handed it to Wilhelm. Wilhelm took it, understanding the symbol immediately, the cycle completing itself. The gift passed forward across generations, across oceans, across the vast distance from 1945 to today. That night, Wilhelm could not sleep. He sat in his hotel room, looking out over the lights of Berlin, holding the bread the young soldier had given him. He thought about his mother, who had died peacefully in her sleep 15 years earlier, surrounded by family, her last words a prayer of gratitude for a long life she never expected to have. He thought about Greta, now retired from nursing, living in Hamburg with her husband, spending her days volunteering at a refugee center because she remembered what it meant to be desperate and displaced. He thought about James O'Donnell, who never knew the full impact of what he had done that frozen December morning, who had died thinking he was just one soldier who tried to do the right thing, unaware that his kindness would echo forward through decades, touching lives he would never meet. And Wilhelm understood, finally and completely, what Anna had tried to teach him all those years ago. That we never know the full consequences of our actions. That small mercies can become great legacies. That the bread we share today might feed souls we will never see. He took out a piece of hotel stationery and began to write. Not for publication, not for posterity, but simply because the words demanded to be written. To James O'Donnell, wherever you are. I am 81 years old now. I have lived a full life. Marriage, children, grandchildren, a career that gave me purpose and meaning. I have traveled the world. I have known love and loss, joy and sorrow, all the beautiful complications of being human. And none of it would have been possible without you, without the choice you made to see a starving enemy child as just a child, just a human being who needed help. You gave me bread, yes, but you gave me something more precious. You gave me the future. Every moment of my life, since that day, has been a gift from you. Every student I taught, every child I raised, every act of kindness I tried to pay forward, all of it traces back to your compassion. I hope you knew, before you died, that you mattered, that what you did mattered, that you changed the world, not through violence or victory, but through the simple, radical act of treating your enemy with dignity. I carry you with me every day. In my memories, yes, but also in my actions, in the way I move through the world, in the choice I make again and again to believe in the possibility of human goodness. Thank you does not seem like enough, but it is all I have. Thank you, James. Thank you for my life." Wilhelm folded the letter and placed it in his wallet, next to a photograph of his mother and a faded picture of himself at age 8, thin and serious, holding a piece of bread. The next morning, he flew home to Heidelfeld. The village had prepared a small ceremony in honor of the documentary premiere. The mayor gave a speech about the importance of remembering history. A local historian unveiled a plaque near the site of the old village square, commemorating the day in December 1945 when American soldiers brought relief to a starving community. The plaque bore 2 names, Sergeant James O'Donnell and Anna Mueller. And beneath their names, a simple inscription. "They taught us that compassion knows no borders, and kindness recognizes no enemies." Wilhelm stood before the plaque, surrounded by townspeople and journalists and curious onlookers. He placed his hand on the cold metal, tracing the letters of those 2 names, the soldier and the mother, the giver and the receiver. 2 lives forever intertwined by one moment of grace. "My mother used to say," Wilhelm told the assembled crowd, "that the bread James gave us that day was the most important meal of her life, not because it filled her stomach, but because it fed her hope. It reminded her that the world, despite everything, still contained goodness, that humanity could survive even its darkest hours." She was right. The bread sustained our bodies for one day, but the kindness behind it has sustained my soul for 73 years. An elderly woman in the crowd raised her hand. She had been 5 years old in 1945, living 3 villages over. Her family had also received help from American soldiers. "My father told me similar stories," she said, "about soldiers who gave when they did not have to, who showed mercy when the world expected revenge." I think we sometimes forget, in our comfortable modern lives, how radical that kindness was, how much courage it took to choose compassion. Wilhelm nodded. "Yes, we forget that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the choice, made daily, to treat others with dignity even when we disagree, even when we have been hurt, even when every instinct screams for retaliation. James O'Donnell taught me that, and I have tried to teach it to everyone I meet." A young reporter asked, "Do you think people today can learn from this story? Or is it too old, too distant to matter?" Wilhelm smiled. "History is never distant. It lives in us, in the choices we make, in the way we treat strangers. Every day, we face versions of the same choice James faced. Do we see others as human? Do we extend compassion even when it is difficult? Do we choose to break cycles of hatred rather than perpetuate them? Those questions are timeless, and so is the answer this story provides." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence. Wilhelm stood with his eyes closed, remembering the cold, the hunger, the fear, and then the impossible sight of soldiers handing out bread, his mother's tears, the warmth of the blanket, the taste of soup that saved his life. And he remembered the promise he had made as a child, to pass it forward, to make sure James's kindness was not forgotten, to honor the gift of his own survival by living a life worthy of the sacrifice others had made. He had kept that promise. And now, standing in the rebuilt village square, surrounded by people who had been moved by his story, he understood that the promise would outlive him, that the story would continue to spread, carried forward by teachers and students, filmmakers and journalists, parents and children who recognized themselves in the tale of 2 people who chose humanity over hatred. As the crowd dispersed, Wilhelm walked alone to the cemetery where his mother was buried. He knelt beside her grave and spoke quietly. "I told your story, Mama, just like you asked me to. The world knows now what you survived, what we survived. And they know it was because one man chose kindness. I think you would be pleased." The wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere, a bird sang. "Life, persistent and beautiful," continued. Wilhelm stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He was an old man now, his time growing short. But he was not afraid. He had lived well. He had loved deeply. He had tried, every day, to honor the gift James O'Donnell had given him 73 years ago. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. He walked back through the village, past children playing in streets that were once filled with rubble, past homes rebuilt on the foundations of destruction, past gardens blooming where bombs had once fallen. The village had healed. The nation had healed. But the scar remained not as a wound, but as a reminder of what humans were capable of, both the worst and the best. That evening, Wilhelm sat in his study, surrounded by books and photographs and letters from people around the world who had been touched by his story. He opened his desk drawer and took out the wooden cross he had made as a child. It was weathered now, the carved initials barely visible, worn smooth by decades of handling. He held it to his chest, feeling its weight, its history, its meaning. And he whispered one final prayer, not to God, but to James. A prayer of gratitude, a prayer of remembrance, a prayer that wherever James's soul had gone, he knew that his kindness had mattered, that it had rippled forward through time, touching lives he would never meet, inspiring goodness he would never witness. You were not just a soldier, James, Wilhelm whispered. You were a teacher. You taught me how to live, how to forgive, how to see the humanity in others, even when the world says they are your enemy. That lesson, that simple, profound lesson, is your true legacy. And it will survive as long as people tell this story. As long as someone remembers that on a cold December morning in 1945, compassion broke through the darkness and changed everything. The cross lay warm in his palm. Outside, the sun set over Heidelfeld, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. The same sky that had hung over the village in 1945, the same sky that would hang over it long after Wilhelm was gone. But the story would remain, passed from generation to generation. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, light could break through. That kindness, once given, never truly dies. That bread shared in hunger becomes a feast that feeds the soul for a lifetime. And somewhere, in the great mystery beyond this world, perhaps James O'Donnell knew. Perhaps he understood that the small act of compassion he showed to a starving boy had grown into something larger than he ever imagined. A legacy, not of victory or conquest, but of simple human decency. The kind of legacy that actually matters. The kind that changes hearts rather than borders. The kind that reminds us all what we are capable of when we choose love over hate. The kind that survives,